Okay. All right, with that out of the way, you do need to be thinking about your paper's topic, any topic that excites you or interests you. And believe me, there's a lot of topics, particularly this time period here. So much of the things that influence us today happen or got started during this time period we're talking about. Whether it be evolution, we talked about last time, or communism, which we'll talk about, or psychoanalysis, which we'll also talk about. These ideas had got their beginning during the time period that we're discussing. In other words, the late 1800s, early 1900s. Let me ask you too, was the traffic bad or? Oh, no, just, no, yes, okay. All right.
A couple minutes late.
Just asking. It was really bad for me, but that's. All right. Now, we are on chapter 20. And actually, I didn't have my notes set up right, but we actually have been on chapter 20 since we started talking about Latin America and Simon Bolivar. So, we are on chapter 20. Start off with realism. In those days, art strove for realism, and this was to remain true until the invention of the camera. Now, realism meant they tried to make a statue of an apple so real that a deer would come up and try to bite into it. Today, we don't look on that as being ideal. The cameras, they depict realistic, but eventually art became left realism and got into what you call surrealism, or trying to picture moods, things that the camera does not picture. In literature, in addition to Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens wrote about the poor. He's also famous for his story about Ebenezer Scrooge, which is the movie about Scrooge is shown every Christmas. Most of you might have seen it. But again, the movie about a rich man, the rich people are depicted by him as being the bad, evil people. And the poor are depicted as being the innocent victims. Be that as it may, Charles Dickens somewhat got that idea rolling. You might not say he started it, but he got the idea rolling. The rich are evil, the poor are helpless victims of the rich man's evil. Now, I hope, take this, what I just said in context. Without the rich, we're all poor. So I say let the rich get richer still, because the richer the rich get, the richer I'll get. So yes, the rich might be snakes, but I went to a snake show one time and this man said, I have a pet snake, I also have a dog. But he said, we hate the snakes, but once we kill them, we'll miss them when they're all gone. And believe me, when you get rid of the rich, the nations that have done it missed them. Just ask Venezuela. Venezuela had a president take over. He said, I'm going to help the poor, and he began nationalizing industry, impoverishing the rich. And guess what? Venezuela is suffering terribly today. They have riots, they have starvation. They go to the stores, and the stores sit empty. And the same thing can happen anywhere else. Now, in the latter part of the 1800s, a second industrial revolution occurred. The second industrial revolution was different in that it featured steel more than textiles. Now, the Chinese had invented steel. Steel is made mostly out of iron, but it's iron mixed with magnesium and then mixed with whatever else you want to mix it with, depending on what you want. Steel is lighter than iron, it's stronger than iron. With the invention or perfection of better methods of making more and more steel, they were able to build taller and taller skyscrapers. And today we have skyscrapers that go up more than 1,000 feet, and if you look closely at it, they're made mostly of steel. Bridges. We were able to make better bridges, including bridges that would hold locomotives, heavy locomotives and heavy cargo trains. They're made of steel. Wooden bridges tended to collapse under heavy weight. Steel is also more workable than iron and less likely to rust than iron. And you can make steel, stainless steel, that will not rust very easily at all. Stainless steel is often used in cookware. It's easier to clean than the old cast iron skillet. In the manufacture of steel, Britain led the way, and Germany. Eventually, Germany overtook Britain and became the #1 in the manufacture of steel. Now, on a personal note, my great-grandfather worked in a steel mill, and my grandfather was a structural steel foreman. My grandfather worked in steel, and one of my brothers worked at Armco Steel. So 4 generations in a row of persons who worked in steel. Steel mills used to employ a lot of workers. And young men would get out of college and go to the steel factory. I mean, well, I grew up in Middletown, and Middletown had the big Armco Steel, and they'd employ 7,000 workers, and a lot of my classmates worked at Armco Steel, and so did one of my brothers. They are all retired now. But anyway, steel. Armco made structural steel, again used in the making skyscrapers and making bridges. Electricity began to be used more and more, particularly with 2 inventions, the invention of the light bulb and the electric motor. Well, when I was a kid, I used to love playing with little electric motors, attach them to an electric battery and watch them spin. Don't do that much anymore, but and I used to think, oh, I wish I would own an electric car, but now the electric cars on the market, I don't care for them. And I've analyzed just exactly why, because today's gasoline engine is so much better. A typical gasoline engine today will probably go 400,000 miles if you treat it right. Maybe not that far, but the engine outlasts the car. This is true. Now, the electric motor came into widespread use, and the light bulb. Now, this light bulb is a controversial matter of who invented it. I was taught it was Thomas Edison, but then when I read our history book here, they say, no, it was Thomas Edison in the United States and Joseph Swan in Europe. Today, there is more research being done who say that actually neither Edison nor Swan invented it. It was around before either of them. But I want to elaborate on it. I don't know much about Swan, but on Edison a little bit. When I was a kid, we checked out books about Edison in the library and read about Thomas Edison, boy scientist, how that he tried some experiments that did not work as a boy. But he grew up and made more. He secured more patents than any other individual. He set up a lab in Menlo Lab in New Jersey, and he is credited with inventing the record player, the vinyl record player, the tape recorder. Now, both of those are obsolete today. Today, recording is done digitally, but the tape recorder was been used for many, many generations. The vinyl record player, I just have to ask is, how many of you know what I mean when I say vinyl record player? Okay, most of you do, yeah, all right. It's just some of your hands didn't go up. Anyway, whatever.
I was nodding, sorry.
You know what it is, all right, yeah, well, they're still around. And you can, if you go online, you can still order one of those turntables. There's still, and some of those records, those old records, will bring a lot of money. But anyway, Edison, though, is typical of humanity, had one big problem. He only understood direct current. He did not believe in alternating current. He tried to sell electricity. But if you know about electricity, you start to put direct current. Direct current is no good after about 2 or 3 miles at the most. Then the resistance becomes so high that it's ineffective, which means we'd have to have an electrical generator about every mile apart to supply the DC that people would need. It was up to another man named Tesla, Tesla who gave us alternating current. Alternating current can be sent over more than 1,000 miles. Alternating current can be transformed using a transformer from higher voltages to lower voltages, and that gives it the ability we need to carry it. Now, for these big power lines you see overhead, they're probably carrying 10,000 volts. The 10,000 volts are stepped down to 440 volts for power transformers. And then the 440 volts is what you see in the power lines. And then what goes into your home is 220 and 110. Most homes today have a 220 volts of electricity in them. And what you use 220 volts for, your air conditioners for one, your clothes dryer for another. That's about it. Can anybody think of anything else you'd use 220 volts for? Clothes dryer, air conditioner. Main two, oh yeah, electric stove, possibly heating stove. They work better with 220 volts. But anyway, and Edison did not understand alternating current, and that's one reason he did not go as far as he might have gone. Now, Edison lived to be in his early 80s, and he had encouraged Henry Ford to get started. I'll talk about Ford later. Let's see. And so Ford was honoring him one day, and Edison had a stroke. There is a room in Edison's house. The room contains a picture, and Edison told his family, I'm going to, after I die, I'm going to find a way to come back using electricity. And when I do, I'm going to move that picture. The family is embarrassed by it, but the picture has been left alone. It's still there. It has never been moved. You take that for what it's worth. Edison was an atheist until the last 10 years of his life, when he became more of an agnostic, leaned more toward religion and toward an afterlife. With all respects, I probably know more about electricity than Edison did, but then again, I came along a lot later than Edison did. All right. At one point, coal was the main fuel that people used to heat their homes and run their steam engines. Then oil came into widespread use, replacing coal. Oil is a lot easier, more convenient, easier to flow. Then came the invention of the internal combustion engine. And the internal combustion engine led to the invention of two things, the automobile and the airplane. I mentioned how that the steam is, nobody has ever made a steam airplane because the steam engine is just simply too heavy. But with an internal combustion engine, the automobile was invented. Now, who invented the automobile? That's one of the biggest mysteries of world history. A bunch of them just appeared all of a sudden in both Europe and the United States. Kokomo, Indiana is believed to be the first place that put them together, but even that's debatable. Your history books simply are silent as to who invented the automobile. But the airplane, we know who invented that. We think we do. The Wright brothers. Now again, you might have heard other stories. The Wright brothers were from Dayton, Ohio, but they wrote to the National Weather Service to find out where in the country there was an uplift. The Weather Service said Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, so they got on a train with their plane, took it to Kitty Hawk, and they got the plane off the ground. Then a gust of wind broke it to pieces after 3 flights. So they went back to Dayton and then rented a cow pasture, and they reasoned that, hey, we've got, if this thing's going to work at all, it's going to be able to work anywhere. So they rented a cow pasture, and they flew their plane. They had to do something else. So once they invented it, they had to sell it. The idea didn't catch on at first. After all, we had the balloon, and balloons appeared to be safer. Then, finally, some people saw the advantage of it, and the invention of the airplane took off. Now, sadly, folk, if the Wright brothers were alive today, I mean, I spent 27 years in an airplane factory. About the only thing they could do at Lockheed today or any other factory is work as a custodian or as a laundry room attendant, they had a serious weakness. They could not use anything that they did not understand. Unless they fully understood everything about how it works, they wouldn't use it. Well, the airplane, along with it came inventions like weather radars, altimeters, it tells how high you're up, and wind direction finders, none of which they understood. Then came radio and radar. GPS came later, and again, which they didn't understand. Folk, I keep this device here. There is no one human being who can understand everything about how it works. It's put together by teams. And the same way with today's airplanes, it is humanly impossible to understand how every device in today's airplanes work. The term black box is used, where that you just simply put in a device in a plane and you don't know how it works. But you might know what it does, you don't know how it works. You just simply put it in because the paperwork told you to. And but again, they could not use anything unless they understood it. Unfortunately, Wilbur Wright died of typhoid fever in 1916, and his brother quit flying after 1919. Planes do crash, and sometimes the pilot has no control over it. Most crashes have always been blamed on pilot error. Anyway, the airplane was destined to change the way things think. Wilbur Wright lived long enough, and his plane was made of canvas and balsa wood, really light wood and canvas, and piano string and the bicycle chain. He lived long enough to see planes made out of aluminum. He died in 1948, and lived long enough to see them made into weapons of war. All right. Now, Henry Ford did not, I repeat, did not invent the automobile, but he was the first person to mass produce them. He got the idea that, hey, if I could get it on an assembly line and put out one car a minute, the assembly line. Basically, his big contribution was the assembly line. He also paid his workers more than anyone else around, which meant two of them would have meant he could pick his workers, and also he guaranteed that once his workers worked for him, they wouldn't want to quit. And when I was at Lockheed, I'd almost count the days when I could retire, and I retired the first month I had a chance to. That's the first. All right, leave me in it. But anyway, the assembly line was where that a person would just simply, like one person would put a tire on and bolt it down, and then another person, he'd send the car on. So actually, maybe all four tires would go on at once. 4 different men put the 4 tires on. Once the tires are on, and send it to the next part of the assembly line. At one point in the assembly line, they started with a frame. They put the tires on, and from the frame and the tires, somebody would put the engine in place. The engine would be assembled, the transmission would be put in behind the engine, so on and so forth. Then the radiator might be put on, and a bunch of other parts. Eventually, the body would drop down from the roof, from the ceiling, and drop down and cover up the engine and transmission. Seats would be installed, etc., etc. They could put out a car once every minute. And then the car would, they'd start the car engine and drive the car off under its own power. Today, they try to put a car out every 30 seconds, and robots do a lot of the work. Assembly line work is very, very monotonous. And you work on something like that, you feel like the work will never end. Now, airplanes aren't quite put together that way. I mean, there are assembly lines, but all the workers do more than one job. With a car company, a worker might put a bolt here and a nut here, tighten the bolt and nut and pass it on. Bolt here, nut here, tighten the bolt and nut and pass it on. Anyway, Henry Ford, he was the last of the big auto workers, the last big auto owners to allow his workers to form a union. He only did it after his wife persuaded him to. There was a story one day that some man's car broke down and he felt real helpless. Up drove a man. The man got out to help him, and hey, folks, don't do this today. But at one time in America, you could help someone who was stranded, broken down. Today, you might call for help, but don't stop and help them. But anyway, someone came up and helped him. in a short order, that man got the car to work. The man whose car had broken down said, well, who do I thank? The man said, hey, I built this car. My name is Henry Ford. This is supposed to have actually happened. Henry Ford, yeah, he knew the car. He had built it. Henry Ford even used the crates that these parts were shipped in as floorboards. In other words, nothing went to waste. Today we wouldn't think of doing that. All right. Oh yeah, Henry Ford put out his car cheaper. Eventually, I mean, today Ford is part of the big three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And a lot of his cars lasted a long time because they were easy to work on. Typically, at the Model T Ford, which he put out year in and year out, a lot of them lasted 25 years. There were 25 million Model Ts produced. And the last time I heard, there are still 1 million Model Ts registered in the United States. You won't see them on the road, but if you go to car shows, you'll see one or two of them. I've seen several of them myself. And they're restored to factory condition. In some cases, maybe even better than factory condition. All right, Henry Ford. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. The telephone did a lot to change our way of communication. No, Alexander Graham Bell did not invent the phone that we carry around in our shirt pockets. That was a dream that was to come later. But he invented that his phones, he had to have wires to connect them. Now, the telephone was invented in 1876, before we knew anything about wireless. Right here. Marconi is credited with inventing the wireless radio. Marconi read an article about a man who had sent sparks over the airwaves. And Marconi, well, why didn't that man figure if you can send sparks, why didn't he send code, communication? So Marconi invented the radio. The first radios were crude compared to today's radios. But anyway, he eventually got a radio that could go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. He built a more powerful. He went to a meeting one time where he said, "Gentlemen, the time has come to act." And one of them said, "Act? We've been acting." "Oh no," he said, I want to send a signal all the way across the ocean." Up until that time, radio signals would not travel more than 250 miles. They were great for ship to shore. Marconi sent a man to Canada. Now, actually, no, Marconi himself went to Canada while his transmitter remained behind in England. And the transmission that was sent from England was received by Marconi in Canada. And this was the beginning of radio. Today, we have received radio signals from Pluto. I mean, we sent a satellite to Pluto. Let me clarify. We sent a satellite to Pluto, and that satellite took pictures. And by now, all the pictures it took of Pluto and its moon Charon and the other moons around Pluto have been sent back to us. Marconi, inventor of the wireless. His radio, by the way, would be illegal with today's standards because it would interfere with everything out there. It would interfere with phone services, whatever. But today we've made them much better. Sewing machines. The sewing machine was invented. A man named Singer. Again, Singer did not invent a sewing machine, but he saw one time. He actually was asked to repair one and broken down, and he said, "I can make a better one." So Hal, the man who invented it, sued Singer and won in court. So Singer had to pay Hal money, but nevertheless Singer was able to put out his own machine, and he made it so well and so cheap that it found its way into American homes. And many, many American homes still has a sewing machine in it. Not as much as they once did, but the old sewing machines did not have electric motors, so they were operated by foot pedal. You'd pedal with your foot and it would turn the machine. Has anyone ever seen one of those? Okay, all right, a few are good. You know what I'm talking about. Now, today's sewing machines always have electric motors in them. I have used a sewing machine a little bit, but I'm not skilled at it. Sewing machines, they were all part of the second industrial revolution. The light bulb, the telegraph, the airplane, the internal combustion engine, the mass-produced automobile, all part of the second industrial revolution. Now, tariffs. All right, when I was in Ohio, we take achievement tests every year, and I remember one test question was one issue that has plagued every administration from Washington to present. The correct answer was the tariff. At one time, tariffs was the only way the central government had to get money. So it was a matter of taxing. It was a tax on imported goods. So goods you bought from another country. Now, our Constitution forbids taxes on exports. So what's exported the government can't tax? But they tax imports. But governments at this time began to protect their home industries by putting tariffs. And why would you want to protect home industry? Particularly a nation like the United States was paying its workers more than other countries. Well, that meant that other countries could produce the same product cheaper. So, to make sure we kept our high standard of living and higher wages, we put a tariff on our products to make sure that the other countries' products cost more than ours, because they had to pay a tariff and we didn't. Now, the reason that that's still important is a lot of countries were charging really, really high tariffs on American products and expecting us to keep our tariff low on their products. And our present president says that's not fair. I mean, he has the figures to show it, that they're charged, so that's not fair, so he started trade wars. We don't know what the outcome will be. But again, the tariff issue is still the issue. Economic experts have said tariffs should be low. But the tariff was a big issue during the Depression because our president at that time raised the tariff, and the result was the Depression got worse. We'll have more to say about tariffs as time goes on. But tariffs were used to protect home industries. Factories became larger. Factories could put out better and better products. Production became more efficient. In other words, it took fewer workers to make, and they made more products. Machinery, new machines were invented. Assembly lines were used. Precision tools made the assembly line possible. Europe divided itself into two zones, the industrial zone and the agricultural zone. The industrial zone, Britain, France, Germany, North Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, the agriculture countries, Spain, Portugal, the Balkan kingdoms, Russia, and most of Austria-Hungary. And by the way, the agricultural nations remain poor, typically poor, including Spain, Portugal, the Balkan, that's Greece and Yugoslavia, Russia, they remain behind. Hungary, they remain behind. But there finally was a true world economy because trains could carry goods faster. Eventually railroad lines ran from Berlin to Baghdad, and eventually Russia built a railroad line that went from Moscow all the way to the Pacific Ocean called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. That railroad's, I believe, about 4,000 miles long. Railroads were built across the Sahara Desert. All this made for, and also ships got bigger and bigger and bigger. Huge, huge ships. Then they could carry goods more cheaply. The bigger ships could carry goods more cheaply. All right, folk. Women. At first, they tried to keep women out of the workforce, but women found that they could work as teachers. There was a time when all teachers were men, but then it was found that women generally did a better job teaching very young students, particularly 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. So the first profession that was once a male profession and women took over was teaching.